Hello and welcome everyone. It's Tamara Anderson from Building Successful Lives Speech and Language Services. Today we will be discussing ADHD and executive functioning, and I have an excellent guest today, Michael McLeod. He's an ASHA Certified Speech Language Pathologist and Executive Functioning and ADHD Specialist. He focuses on the unique and innovative skill of internal language while constructing interpersonal relationships and meaningful varied experiences for students. The evidence-based GrowNow model utilizes a holistic approach towards decreasing prompt dependency, fostering independence, strengthening executive functioning through the lens of academic, social, and emotional methodology. Michael is the owner of GrowNow Therapy Services, LLC, a specialized private practice in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He has traveled internationally, which is pretty awesome, presenting and training families and professionals on his unique GrowNow therapy treatment model for fostering executive functions and resiliency, which all of that is a mouthful, but it sounds pretty fantastic. And we know that there's definitely a connection between children that have language impairments and frontal lobe difficulties at times. And we know that it involves higher level cognitive and thinking skills and language skills. And those skills are highly connected with academic and life success, which is definitely, as a therapist, our end result is how can we have these kids succeed and progress on their various goals. So welcome so much, Mike and Michael.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was quite the intro. I really appreciate that.
You're very welcome. And definitely we just know this is an excellent topic that can really help clinicians in their everyday practice, whether they work in the school-based setting or private practice. It's just very important. So can you kindly explain what is executive functioning and how is it important to daily life skills?
Awesome. Great intro question. So what are executive functions? There are so many different definitions, so many different ways to describe them. Whether I'm talking to a parent or a colleague or another speech and language pathologist, I may give a different definition. But overall, executive function skills are true life independent skills. So if you have weak executive functioning, you are prompt dependent on adults. And you are prompt dependent on people with strong executive functioning. If you have strong executive functioning, you can be independent in your day-to-day. So if you have a weakness in executive functioning, such as ADHD, autism, executive dysfunction disorder, whatever it may be, you are going to be prompt dependent on someone with a strong executive functioning system to almost act as your frontal lobe to help you in these independent skills. So in terms of executive functioning, a lot of people like to describe it as like the air traffic controller of the brain. So it's the part of the brain that kind of manages everything, takes in all the information, makes sure everything is arriving smoothly, departing smoothly, moving together, and all the different aspects of your life are organized, on time, and smooth. So executive functioning is cognitive system, the cognitive system of the brain, and it is crucial to lifelong success. What we now know about executive functioning is they are a greater predictor of success than IQ. So it's individuals with strong executive functioning that go on to college and are able to succeed. They're successful in their career and they're successful in their lives. So executive function skills are true life skills that allow an individual to be independent, productive, and successful.
I think that's a fantastic explanation because basically they're the everyday skills that individuals need to achieve. Of course, academics is important, literacy skills and all of that, but all of those different things, that frontal brain function there, helping the planning and the organization and all of that, which is why it's so important to really provide that therapeutic intervention.
Yep.
What may a child or adolescent with executive functioning challenges experience regularly in the school setting and then also perhaps in their home environment?
That's a great segue. So executive functioning, like I said, are true life skills. So when I talk about executive functioning, I like to separate them into three separate areas. There's home executive functioning, academic executive functioning or school executive functioning, and social executive functioning. So I'm sure we'll be talking about all three areas today. But in terms of the school, with executive functioning and executive dysfunction, in the past, we looked at ADHD and executive dysfunction as more of a behavioral disorder. which is why it was labeled as an attention deficit and labeled as kids who were hyperactive or inattentive. So now we have the labels ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity, and ADD, which is more inattentive. So it was labeled towards kids that we saw with our eyes, kids who couldn't sit still and kids who couldn't focus. And that's really an outdated view. And this is why so many kids with ADHD fall through the cracks, are never diagnosed, don't get the services they need, and they're labeled as lazy or disinterested. But what we now know about ADHD is it's not really about hyperactivity and inattentiveness. It's really about a couple of core skills. So number one is self-regulation. So this is the ability to regulate your language, your body, your emotions, your actions, your behaviors in various environments towards various stimuli. Then the big one that parents always seem to connect with is self-motivation towards non-preferred tasks. So that's a big part of executive functioning. Then there's self-evaluation, and that's the ability to learn from past experiences and take that experience and take that information and apply it to the present moment so you're not repeating mistakes over and over and over again. So the work that I do with executive functioning does not have to do with hyperactivity and inattentiveness. It has to do with self-regulation, self-motivation, self-evaluation, and those three skills all come back down to internal language. So like we said in the beginning, everything comes back to language. It's all about language. And those three core executive function skills are based in internal language. And internal language is nonverbal working memory, which is the visual imagery system of the brain, which is the ability to create mental movies, hold images in mind, manipulate them, re-image the relevant past, forecast yourself into the future, and be able to have these images and these movies in your brain that allow you to regulate yourself, motivate yourself, and evaluate yourself. And then there's verbal working memory, which is the self-directed talk system, which is the self-talk system, the brain coach system. It's really internal dialogue. And it's the ability to have an internal system of checks and balances that allow you to talk to yourself, manage your emotions, and self-regulate in the moment. So the ability to visualize to oneself and the ability to talk to oneself is internal language. And in the school setting, there is a whole subset of school executive functioning. So an individual with executive dysfunction in the school could really have great difficulty initiating the non-preferred academic tasks. So starting a task in class, persisting throughout that task towards completion can be really, really hard for them, especially in a large classroom environment. They could really need a lot of one-to-one support and extra support. In schools, you see a lot of kids with executive dysfunction have great difficulty with reading comprehension and writing. So reading comprehension and writing are the two core academic skills that kids with ADHD and executive dysfunction have a lot of trouble with. And that all comes back down to what I just talked about with visual imagery. Visual imagery is needed for writing. You have to visualize what you're reading to fully understand it and to enjoy it and to be motivated to read. And then writing requires an immense amount of executive functioning. You have to have planning, you have to plan it up here in your brain first. You have to organize the information. You have to transfer it down from your hand to the pen to the paper. You have to be regulated while you write. It takes time. It's a delayed gratification. There's a lot of issues there. So self-motivation could be a major issue. Regulating their emotions at school could be difficult as they're challenged by multiple classes and multiple tasks, as well as their social peers and things happening at school. So kids that show consistent and chronic issues with regulating their emotions, initiating non-preferred tasks, completing non-preferred tasks, reading comprehension, writing expression, these are kids that we should start red flagging and highlighting for potential executive dysfunction or ADHD.
And that's definitely excellent information that you just shared there, Michael. And I could definitely see from my observations between the school system and private practice, there's a number of kids with the language disorders, ADHD, all those things in some children co-occur and with children with different levels of autism or autistic adults, autistic children and adolescents. And then I love what you say about visualization, right? Getting them to visualize what is the end goal. This is what I need you to achieve, whether it's doing this particular task after a mini lesson or whatever the teacher's talking, and how would you work through that, right? How do you work through those processes? That's important. And then the self-talk that you talked about, I think that's very important too. I'm getting the kids to be cognizant of that, because a lot of them, are just very oblivious to it, right? So being able to train them in that way, give them the therapeutic intervention to hone in on those particular skills. I think that's fantastic. And, you touched on a lot of other areas there, but that internal language, the self-regulation, emotional regulation, task initiation, I see the kids in small group and sometimes individually, but when the general education teacher or a special education teacher, they may do better in speech in a small setting, but even in a special education setting with more students or in a larger class, the kids who are into collaborative education and getting collaborative reading and writing, you can see where the breakdown is there, because in a big class, they just get lost. They really need that co-teacher, that special education teacher in there with them to kind of keep them on track, get them to initiate, get them to kind of continue with their lesson, whatever they're working on. So those skills are life skills, right? The academic life skills.
Yeah.
Of course, whether they're a public school or a private school, it's the same thing,
Absolutely. Yeah. And us as speech pathologists, we have this great intensive training. Getting a master's degree in speech pathology is really, really, really hard. And then getting certified and getting your C's, it is a process that nobody, unless you've done it, it's hard for you to respect it and hard for you to understand it. SLPs work really, really hard, and our training is difficult. And we are true masters in building expressive language, receptive language, social pragmatic language, all of the training we have to build MLU, to build vocabulary, all of these things, as we have such intensive training in language, in building expressive language, strengthening receptive language, all of this great language training. It's really that same training. The biggest issue with internal language is that it can't really be measured. So it's really hard for it to be used clinically or be part of an IEP process. We're never really going to be able to measure visual imagery or self-talk. It's internal, it's private, but it's something that people with strong executive functioning and adults use every day. As soon as you wake up in the morning, before you even get out of bed, you say to yourself, okay, I need to brush my teeth by this time. I should eat this for breakfast. If I get out the door by this time, I'll get to work by 9 o'clock. I'll get there right on time. And we do that in a split second in our brains to plan ahead and to make our mornings smooth and appropriate. But kids with executive dysfunction and ADHD don't have that internal voice. They don't talk to themselves. They can't visualize themselves in the future. They're stuck in the now. They're stuck in the present moment. It's hard for them to see what's coming, so they can't plan for it and they can't prepare for it. So mornings are really, really hard for kids with ADHD. Writing tasks, reading tasks, tons of academic tasks, social. It's really, really hard. And it all comes back down to their inability to have an internal dialogue.
Right. And you can see why it's so important to work on all those skills, elementary school level, middle school level, high school, because after they graduate high school, go into college or vocational training or try to get a job, it's important, right? Because if not, you'll start to see even more breakdowns the older they get. So it's very important to touch on.
Yeah. I can't.
Right.
I can't.
Soccer team or to interact in a variety of ways, a family picnic, anything, right? You can see the breakdown that could occur in the home environment as well.
Absolutely.
Why do you believe it is important for speech pathologists to target, we kind of touched on this, executive functioning versus social language groups? I know a lot of times I've worked with a lot of kids with autism. We do social language groups with certain things, teaching them to initiate, make requests, make comments, things like that. But it's kind of a new way of thinking in a sense in the school setting to target the executive functioning versus social language. Can you just explain perhaps, is that something you would agree with, or what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So we've really gotten into a habit, us as SLPs, for throwing kids that have social difficulties, social awkwardness into these social groups. And that's really, really putting these kids at a disservice, especially when their core issues are executive functioning. So I mentioned before, home executive functioning, academic, and social. So when it comes to social executive functioning, there's three key things for us to be aware of. The first is perspective taking skills. And that's the ability to think about someone else's thinking. So everything I've described already describes how kids with ADHD have great difficulty thinking about their own thinking. There's no visual imagery, there's no internal dialogue, and if there is, it's delayed and it's weak. So it's even more difficult for them to think about someone else's thinking and to know what kind of thoughts they're putting into someone else's head. That's really, really hard for them to understand. So kids with ADHD tend to dominate conversations. They tend to act like they're disinterested. They tend to avoid them. And we see this externally with our eyes of kids who are stuck on their phones, kids who are playing video games, kids who aren't socializing at lunch or recess, whatever it may be. It's really because of their executive functioning. And social is really, really hard for them. And they can't self-regulate during social conversations. And they can't motivate themselves to interact with peers and to keep up with the pace of conversation. So perspective taking is really, really hard. And that leads to a myriad of difficulties within social contexts. So there's perspective taking, and there's also something called situational awareness, or what I like to refer to as reading the room, which is the ability to sort of stand back when you enter a room or a new environment and observe and see what everybody else is doing, read their body, read their language, read their actions, read their behaviors, and sort of get a grasp on what's happening. And so that you can enter that environment, or you can enter that action, activity, whatever it is, and not stand out and not be different, and sort of be able to acclimate yourself and assimilate into that environment, like going into a library and decreasing your volume, or going into class and sitting at your desk and taking your folder out, or going home and sitting at the dinner table instead of running home and running into your room to be on your phone. So there's a lot of that as well. So the inability to sort of stand back and take a mental movie, a mental picture of what's happening and change your actions based on it. That's really hard for them. And then number three is social relatedness. And that's the ability to intimately relate to someone else and listen to a conversation about their likes and their interests and have a true 50-50 conversation. That's really, really difficult for these kids. So once again, all these skills are internal: perspective taking, situational awareness, social relatedness. They're internal and they can't be measured. So a lot of kids present with social pragmatic difficulties. Let's throw them into a group so we can get more and more exposure. You can give them tons of exposure. You can be in a group with 10 kids who are typically developing, could be the best social group of all time. It's going to be really hard to build perspective taking skills and situational awareness skills in a social group. These kids need one-on-one executive functioning therapy and then put into a social group where they're observed, and then a follow-up one-on-one session to break down what happened in the group. So executive functioning can present itself as a social pragmatic issue, but at its core, it's executive dysfunction.
Because it takes the planning and stuff to how to interact socially with their peers. And I know I've worked with kids with autism where they have goals on their IEP to work on perspective taking. So you might give them social scenarios and say, what would you do if, or what would you say if? And I have kids who are very bright, high functioning, or Asperger's really. A lot of folks don't use that term anymore, but very what we call high functioning, which I hate to categorize autism these days. But you know that they can answer all of those questions 100%, right? What would you do if? What would you say if? But put them in the social situation, and there's a complete breakdown. So the generalization is still something that we know, it's a part of their neurotypical, right? And that's
exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And so many kids with ADHD have a really above average IQ and they present as typical, but internally they're really, really struggling.
Yes. Very interesting. Excellent information that you're sharing. I appreciate it very much. What are some practical tips that speech language pathologists can provide teachers and families to improve the academic and daily functioning for children and adolescents with ADHD? And I know we talked about the overlap with executive functioning and ADHD, but if you can give like 3 tips for ADHD.
Sure, absolutely. So the number one thing you want to remember is that all executive functioning starts with nonverbal working memory and the visual imagery system. So if you can start to build the habit within your speech sessions, within the classroom of having the children visualize the end result. And if it's age appropriate, they can draw the end result, they can discuss it out loud, whatever it may be. And then you can use real world pictures in the classroom. So if you have a student that has a lot of difficulty doing their work or doing writing or reading, take a picture of him one day when he is reading and use that picture of him reading as the visual prompt that triggers his visual imagery. Instead of the verbal prompt, sit down and get your book, show him a picture of him with his book. And that will trigger his nonverbal working memory and be a lot less anxiety producing and probably behavior producing than saying, sit down and get your book. So always think visual imagery first. How can I help these kids to start with the end in mind, help them to plan backwards so that they can execute forwards? So many kids avoid, have behaviors, do whatever they can to manipulate the situation because they simply cannot visualize the end result. They don't know how long that math packet will take. They don't know how long that writing assignment, that reading assignment will take. They think it'll take them hours and hours and hours, so they don't even start. Help them to figure out what it looks like when it's done so that they can plan backwards. So that's
begin with the end in mind, and then they can say, here's the end result. This is a day that you did it, maybe snap a photo or whatever. Here's a day that you did your math assignment or did a math thing, have a picture of that, a literacy assignment that they have to do, and then say, this is the goal, but you don't say it. Speech therapists are always chatty and talking. Show it to them, visualize it, not verbal.
Exactly. So anytime you can put the visual imagery there is huge. Another thing is with executive dysfunction, you're always looking for speed and instant gratification. That's something to always be aware of. So another thing that you can kind of instill the habit in your classroom is a little bit of mindfulness, a little bit of deep breaths and breaks. Before you start your homework, before you start your assignment, before you start something, sit back in your chair, close your eyes, visualize something, take a few deep breaths. You always want the kids to stop, think, talk to themselves, and then do. So many kids want to jump in, get it done as fast as possible so they can move on to a non-preferred task. You really want to help these kids to be able to inhibit and stop and stop themselves before they have an impulsive action. And then another thing, so we talked about inhibition, which is basically, the first executive function to develop along with nonverbal working memory, which is visual imagery. And then you have verbal working memory, which is the self-talk system. So as a teacher, or a parent, of course, you can always model your internal language, your brain coach. You can model that constantly to your students. When you're writing on the board or you're grading papers or you're doing something in the classroom, don't talk to yourself privately and silently. Make it external. Let your kids hear how you talk to yourself, how you motivate yourself, how you're kind to yourself, how you're easy on yourself, how you regulate yourself. Make it external so they can hear it and show them, this is what I do to get things done. This is what I do to motivate myself. This is what I do to get through my day today. I visualize and I coach myself. And the more repetition, all of these executive function skills are about repetition. It's very similar to like apraxia therapy, is you want to really get a ton of those targets. Like say you're working on the K sound, you want to get k. You want to have like 100 utterances by the end of the session. With executive functioning, you really just need to do this repetition until you see the natural carryover without adult prompting.
And I love that's excellent information, Michael. Thanks for sharing. And I love what you say about the SLP or the teacher can be the model, but they can verbalize the self-talk. This is what I'm doing if I need to get this task done or this particular written expression activity or the story retell narrative or whatever we're working on. This is what I'm doing to think through this particular process. That's excellent information there.
Thank you.
What are some practical tips that speech language pathologists can provide for children and adolescents with executive function difficulties? And we kind of touched on this. I know you talked about working backwards and all these things, but just in a very practical way for a speech therapist versus a teacher,
Yeah. So
thing that we can do different in August, September,
Yeah. So with speech therapists, they tend to have obviously a much smaller amount of time with the students. So that's something to always be aware of. Some speech therapists have 15-minute sessions or 10-minute sessions. So the number one thing that you want to start to do is just have the student make like slight little predictions about how the session is going to go. So as soon as they sit in the chair, you're in the speech room, whatever it is, sit down and say, okay, what do you think we're going to do today? What does it look like to you? Who do you think is going to help you? How are you going to feel at the end of the session? So before you start jumping into your articulation or your language or your social or your reading or your writing, ask some reflexive questioning and ask them, okay, what do you think things are going to look like 10 minutes from now, 15 minutes from now? What can I do to help you? What are you going to need? And most importantly, how are you going to feel at the end of this session? And this starts to build those future thinking skills, which is visual imagery. So anytime you're able to build future thinking and get the kids thinking about making predictions about the future and planning for the future and seeing if their predictions come true, that's a really fun and quick way to start to build these skills.
I like that. It's really tapping into the metacognitive thinking skills, basically. Thinking about what they're doing, thinking about what they're learning is so they can encode it in their memory and they can visualize it. So the visual with the thinking about it and making predictions. I think that's something really practical.
Yep.
There's definitely a wealth of information there.
Nice.
What is your greatest motivation for providing speech language therapy, ADHD therapy, executive functioning, coaching in your private practice?
Yeah, so I am an individual who was diagnosed ADHD late in life. So it's definitely something I struggled with throughout my childhood and adolescence. Was some of the social executive functioning, and a lot of issues that that I had that I dealt with when I was a kid, and school wasn't always that easy for me, and social and home and all these things were quite difficult. And when you're working on executive function skills, the thing that I love the most about it is you're working on overall quality of life. So if you teach someone and you give them the skills, you give them the strategies to strengthen their executive functioning skills, you are giving them the stepping stones they need to go to college, to get a career, to have a home, to have a family, and be successful when I'm no longer around or their parents are no longer around. And that to me is always more valuable than teaching an academic subject or things like that. And this is what us as SLPs do. Language and speech is what makes the world go around. And executive functioning is that internal language. It is those life skills. And anytime you're able to help someone feel better about themselves, increase their self-worth, increase their social circle, be more successful at things they thought were hard, develop a growth mindset, and you can make that slight change in someone and teach them to start to believe in themselves, that they can do hard things, they can succeed at hard things, they will get good at something over time, doesn't have to be instant. If you can teach them those few things and make their lives easier so they have less breakdowns and less negative self-talk, that to me is what it's all about.
I think that's fantastic. Basically building functional life skills, executive functioning, functioning life skills.
There you go.
Which is so critical for children, adolescents, adults. I think the work that you're doing in your private practice is phenomenal. And I
Thank
think
you so much.
all of us as speech therapists, my big thing is language and literacy. I do a lot of that in my practice, but it's just important and I'm all about well-rounded holistic therapy too, making sure that children are building successful lives. My business is truly an offshoot of my mother's business. She was a clinical psychologist, retired.
Oh, wow.
And I retired because she still does a little teletherapy every now and then, but it's
That's
really
awesome.
about wholeness and how can we get from point A to point B in a very proper way. When I say proper, just being able to have effective functional life skills, which is fantastic. And teaching them how to be good problem solvers, thinking through situations and all of that. I just love the work that you're doing. Do you have what resources do you have for speech language pathologists, special educators, or families to address these areas in children and adolescents? Do you have any resources on your website or maybe coming down the line that you just quick little tips and things for us to refer to?
Definitely check out my website. My website is GrowNowTherapy.com. The name of my practice is GrowNow Therapy, and we use the GrowNow model of internal language. So definitely check that out. I also have a Facebook group called ADHD for Speech Language Pathologists, where I post a lot of information helping SLPs become really the lead therapist for ADHD. I really do believe that obviously the SLP has to be trained in it because it's never discussed in grad school. But I really do believe that at its core, ADHD is based in language. So I have that Facebook group, ADHD for speech language pathologists, to help empower them to be able to treat it and deal with it. I think that could be really beneficial for the future. So that's a great group to check out. There's other SLPs that treat executive functioning in there. It's definitely worth a check out there. The worldwide leader, in my opinion, on executive functioning is Dr. Russell Barkley. You can type him into YouTube. A lot of his lectures are free. He's amazing. Another speech and language pathologist who specializes in executive functioning is Sarah Ward. A lot of people know who that is. She's incredible, the work that she does. A lot of her work on executive functioning has really become like the gold standard for executive function treatment. The Get Ready, Do Done model and the Mind Mime. She's really incredible. Her work's at efpractice.com. She's great. She does a lot of CEU trainings. Definitely check her out if you're an SLP. A good friend of mine, Ryan Wexelblot, is the ADHD dude. You can just Google the ADHD dude. His videos and his resources for parents and clinicians are just tremendous. And he's an incredible person, and he's really on the cusp of a lot of the most recent research. So I would definitely check those people out.
Fantastic. And I will definitely, when I write up this feature on my website, I will include some of those resources for speech pathologists and parents to tap into. I know the services that you're offering are excellent for parents to, have some background in executive functioning and then seek out the therapist in their area. So if you're in the Philadelphia area, definitely go to Michael McLeod.
Yeah, that's right.
In Atlanta, I specialize more in language and literacy and so forth, but I can connect you with resources. I have a lot of psychology friends and other professional colleagues that I can connect you with here in the Atlanta area. But I'm just building successful lives. My business is really a resource, right? A resource for children and families. I want them to be successful. I want them to lead productive lives in a proper way. When I say proper, not to say prim and proper, but basically in a way that they can just be fulfilled, right? It's a well-balanced life holistically, right? So
that's amazing. That's really incredible. You're doing that. That's really, you taking the speech, language, and literacy viewpoint and, turning that into building successful lives. That's really incredible. And that's really, really powerful to kids. Language, literacy, those are some pretty core skills to living a successful life. And you doing that and, and you building that for yourself is really, really amazing.
Thank you so much. And I just, at the end of the day, it's about the children and families that we serve. I'm here in Atlanta, you're up in Philadelphia area, Pennsylvania, and for therapists, around the United States and in other countries. So I'm from Jamaica originally too, and this is a worldwide thing, right? Children have ADHD, they have autism, they have learning disabilities, they have executive functioning, all of that regardless of where they live. So it's all about just making that impact and how we can be a light for the children and families in a positive way. And letting the parents know that it does not matter if your child has a particular diagnosis, or we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses, and we can use our strengths to kind of bolster our weaknesses and work on those weak areas so that we can, make something of our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. You got it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time so much. And if everybody can just check out Michael's resources for further information. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.